Hi everyone, this is your host Alonso. Thank you for joining us a little early here. We are about to get started in 8 minutes. In the meantime, sit tight, and I'll let you know again as we get closer to the top of the hour. Thank you.
Hello, Alonso. Can you hear me? Is that a yes?
Yes, I can hear you,
Norman, I
Norman.
can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Hi, for those who just joined, this is your host Alonso. Thank you so much for joining us early. We're about to get started in 4 minutes. Okay, everyone, we're almost there. As a way to warm up the room, I'd like to tell you where we're broadcasting this webinar today. We are based in the Seattle metropolitan area in an island called Mercer Island. It's a cloudy day today, but we're expecting some better days with more sun. One thing that I wanted to do before we get started is I wanted to invite you, for those who are here early, to join me in the questions box and really quick tell me where are you tuning in from today and what are you looking to learn in this webinar. Now all you have to do to participate is in the question box, uh, submit your comment. We're repurposing this feature here to make this webinar more interactive. Or you could also just say, where are you tuning in from today? Frank Ryan, welcome. Frank is looking to learn how to train better sales reps. Let's see. Welcome Kelly Mullins from Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome Nicole Scott or Scott, something. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, from Oregon. She's tuning in from Bend, Oregon. Welcome Stephanie Overstreet. She is tuning in from Denver, Colorado. Thank you, Nicole, for the feedback. Welcome, Celeste Marek from New York. Oh, Stephanie Overstreet is in Seattle. She's very close to us. We're only across the bridge from her. She's looking to learn how to train new hires and learn more about negotiations. And welcome Danny Brown from Cocoa Beach, Florida. And one more, welcome Johnny Stanshu from San Peter, Florida. Alrighty, so thank you for helping me warm up the room there. Now I think we are ready to get this webinar started. So for those who just joined, I would like to officially welcome to today's webinar on developing highly effective negotiators. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Can we switch to the next slide, please? You should see something that looks like the screenshot on this slide. It looks like we missed it, but we have a slide where basically we have a screenshot and it's basically the screenshot of the sidebar that you're seeing right now in front of your screen for the webinar. So if you're listening using your computer speaker system by default, if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dialing information will be displayed. You have the opportunity to submit text questions and comments by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel, similar like we did for those who decided to tell me where they're from, they're tuning in from. So once you submit your questions, we'll address these in a moment or at the end of the session. Now, here's an important message for all of you. These live interactive webinars work because of you and because of the other people who are part of it. And there are two rules that will help you make the most of this event. Number one is be generous. Every time there is a new chat or question, chime in. Not because you're an expert, not because you're smarter than everyone, but because you're generous. Rule number two, go first. If you're nervous or would prefer to follow, don't. Try it out, put it out there for the rest of us. Finally, yes, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending you a copy in a follow-up email. Now I would like to introduce to our presenters. Today we have two of the principals of the Sales Readiness Group, Norman Behar, as you can see on the left, and David Jacoby on the right. Norman has over 25 years of CEO and senior sales management experience. He's worked with clients in a wide range of industries, including financial services, healthcare, technology, manufacturing, and distribution. Before SRG, Norman served as president and CEO of Catapult Inc., a leading provider of personal computer training services, where he oversaw operations and managed growth before the company's acquisition by IBM. David, on the right, is our Chief Learning Officer here at SRG. He's also one of the principals in the group, and he has a lot of experience developing and implementing sales training and leadership development solutions. He's an expert in instructional design and using innovative technologies to deliver sales training programs. I would like to add that he's also an all-around awesome guy. Before SRG, David worked as Vice President of Business Affairs at Silo, where he was responsible for sales operations, legal affairs, and financing activities. Without further ado, Norman and David, welcome.
Alonso, thank you very much. We're both very excited to be here. It's nice to have such a large turnout, and we're really looking forward to just kind of sharing some thoughts around negotiation. As Alonso mentioned, we'd love to get some team input from everyone who's participating today, and hopefully there's some really nice takeaways related to negotiation and selling that you'll be able to take away from this webinar. As Alonso mentioned, we will have a recording, so we will try and follow up with a recording of the webinar for everyone if you want to review it or share it with others. David, welcome. I know you have a tremendous amount of expertise based on the curriculum design and the content for negotiation, so I'm going to really tap into your expertise as we continue through the webinar.
Thanks, Norm. Negotiation, this is always a topic I love to talk about, and people are just inherently interested in negotiating.
So in the interest of not being too promotional, we have one slide about SRG. As Alonso mentioned, our company really focuses on customized sales and sales management training programs. We feel really strong about our content and the instructional design, our ability to customize that to meet our clients' unique needs, whether those are sales needs, negotiation needs, or sales management training needs, including coaching. And one of the things about all of our programs is they're really built for sustainability. We're using a very strong combination of blended learning and technology to really make sure that the skills people are learning are skills that will stick with them and that can be reinforced and coached to. So with that, we'd like to get right into today's content. And I'm going to ask Alonso for a little bit of a help. We're going to launch our first poll. And I'm just curious, how often do your sales reps resort to discounting during negotiations? So there's always a temptation to discount, and we've opened a poll here. And Dave, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about discounting, but maybe just a couple of high-level thoughts about negotiation and where discounting should come in and shouldn't come in.
Right. So, I mean, it's a common problem with salespeople, and we'll spend a lot of time getting into kind of the who, what, where, when, and how. And it can come in really any time in a negotiation. I've seen it come in pretty much right on the first sales call, right? And I've seen it come in at the absolute last minute. And we'll talk a little bit about when to expect it and some tactics and strategies that your team can use to avoid it.
David, when you and I were chatting earlier this morning, you mentioned something about 3 bites at the apple. And I think it's just, we'll get more into the content later, but why don't you just explain what you meant by 3 bites at the apple, particularly as it relates to discounting?
Yeah, so, when a salesperson is in a sales conversation, so they're now talking to the buyer, bite number 1 is the buyer could say, hey, it seems really expensive. So now the salesperson has a temptation to, boy, if I just, give this person a discount, I'll make him or her happy. That's bite number 1. Now that person could always come back later on and ask for more. But there's going to be a second bite of the apple, which you should prepare for, which is procurement. And then what I call the third bite of the apple, which is legal. So as a salesperson, and we will talk about this, but there's this temptation to give a quick concession really early on when you're still selling, but just be cognizant of the fact that there may be other parties entering the conversation asking for more who weren't part of the sales conversation.
Right. So let's, I think that's really interesting. It was kind of just a, insight, and I see it in our own business. We often work with, professional buyers, many of whom, are, in training and development or on the sales side of the business. We often work with procurement. We also work with legal, and I think it's really interesting comment. So when I look at these results, and I'm looking at the polling results, never, I think, got 0 votes, and the most frequent answers were sometimes, often, and almost always. So we definitely see this propensity to discount, and one of the things we'd like to do is to make sure that if your sales team is discounting, they're using it strategically as part of an overall negotiation and not simply as a concession. So there's a huge difference between making a concession and an overall negotiation. So with that, let's get into some of the content.
Yeah, so, Norm, it doesn't surprise me that no one voted for never, because it almost defies human nature, right? And so when you kind of think about why do reps discount, probably the number one reason is really psychological, that it's really from the rep's point of view, it's the path of least resistance, and that's usually the path that a rep's going to go down. It's just easier to make a concession on the spot than really get into the planning and hard work that a negotiation requires. Also, I think that the rep may not fully understand, and now we have an example coming up, what discounting can do big picture-wise to overall profitability, and it's really devastating on profitability. And I think the last point is another psychological one, which is, from the rep's point of view, they almost feel like they're sitting on the same side of the table as a buyer, that if they make that concession, that buyer is going to be their friend, which of course is not really true. It's a business relationship.
Absolutely. And I think that this is, generally when people are earlier in their career, they want to get business closed, particularly if the incentive plan is around overall sales volume, not profitability or gross margin. They're eager to make that concession with really understanding that either the economic implications or that downstream they probably are setting themselves up for even further discounting. So although there's this perception that you're mentioning that it could improve the relationship, I actually think it might erode the relationship both from a profitability standpoint and for setting up for further concessions or possibly even further discounts. So with that, let's take a look at some of the economics. I know that you prepared a short example, and I think it's interesting to just kind of walk through the math.
Okay, so I'll try to keep it simple, but what we try to do here is just show different cases or different deals with going from a low gross margin, low profitability to high profitability, and just showing how negative discounting can impact overall profitability. So in our first deal, let's just assume that there's a transaction value of $50,000. Your cost of goods sold is $40,000. So before any discounting, your profit is $10,000 or 20%. If you offer a 10% discount, that's 10% on the deal price. The problem is, if you look at to the second of the last row, that your profitability after you give the discount goes from 10,000 to 5,000, or 20% to 10%. That's a 50% impact on profitability. So in a low margin kind of deal, a 10% discount is, which doesn't seem like that much. Well, it's 10%. It's not so bad, but it results in a 50% discount in profitability. If we keep the discount constant, but we say, hey, maybe the deal is more profitable, the impact is still negative. It's just slightly less negative. So it goes in a deal where the profit is $20,000, a 5% discount results in a 25% decrease in overall profitability. And finally, in a high margin deal, discounting, again, isn't as bad. The impact isn't as bad, but it's still negative. It still takes your overall profit down by over 16%. So whatever your business model is, I mean, we have clients where they're SaaS customers where there's no profitability, but their businesses are valued based on a multiple of revenue, and discounting is terrible for them. So whether your business is a low profit margin business or a SaaS model that's super high profit margin, whatever your business model is, discounting negatively impacts it.
Absolutely. And, if you think about the implication of this discount, it doesn't seem like that big a discount. So we had a $50,000 deal, and I decided to price it at $45,000. But clearly, that decision to lower the price by 10% has a huge impact on profitability. But discounts have other problems, and Dave, maybe you could just walk us through some of the other problems with discounting.
Yeah, I mean, it damages your credibility, right? So if your original price that you're quoting, isn't firm, if you're willing to concede quickly on price, it's really signaling that other concessions are available. So your credibility, I mean, what does a price mean when right away you took it down by 10% or 20%? I think also, we obviously talked a lot about hurting profitability. I think when your buyer is asking for a discount, in many cases, it's really a red flag that you're selling too low in the organization. When you're selling at the C level, they rarely haggle, right? If you can demonstrate your value and your unique kind of value proposition, C-level buyers rarely nickel and dime you. I also think that discounting isn't that necessary. It's okay to say no. We'll talk about some things you can do to avoid discounting, obviously, in this webinar. But I think it's really a lot less necessary, and certainly the data backs that up than reps perceive. And I also think that discounting is really, to me, a red flag that your reps, it's a crutch that reps use when they're not able to articulate their value proposition. Discounting is just an easy way for the rep to kind of bridge the gap between the perception of value by the buyer versus the seller.
Absolutely. I think that last point about the value, and it gets into kind of a little bit about selling versus negotiating. So if we think about selling, it's really about identifying needs. We typically do that through call planning and asking great questions and using active listening skills to really identify needs. And then what we want to do is align our solution to that need. And the emphasis there is really on the creation of value. If we truly understand their needs and can align our solution, we've created great value. If we're not able to do that, we probably will have to resort to discounting. And that gets to a little bit more of the distinction between selling and negotiating. So selling is really about aligning your needs to your solution to the needs of the buyer. And negotiating comes after selling. It's really the process of reaching an agreement based on mutually acceptable trades and concessions. And we'll speak more about those. But I think to understand that to really be effective at negotiating, you need to do a great job of selling first, and then you're going to have much more power. And that's a concept we'll talk about more as well when you go to negotiate. So with that, I'd love to turn this back to our participants and put up a poll. And so the way the poll works, and Alonzo, correct me if I've got this wrong, is that you can simply go to the questions pane, the same questions pane you may have used during the introduction, and just start typing in some responses. So I'd really love to get some input as to why sales reps find negotiating challenging.
Yeah, I'm very curious to know what our audience is going to say on this.
Yeah, and Alonzo, if you'll just share the results with us, that'll probably be the easiest for Dave and I. If you could just kind of bring it up, share some of the results as you're seeing them in real time, that would be fantastic.
Nathan Turner, he says, high sales goals that have to be met. Jackie Harris says, low price competition. Nicole Schott says, they aren't confident in selling the value.
Okay.
Let's see who else wants to participate. This is the moment to show us what you got.
Well, I love those three. I think, the high sales goals
are really good.
Resonates with me. This, not confident in the value, competitive landscape. Those are all very, very valid reasons. What else do we have, Alonzo?
So far, that's all we have.
Okay. So those are really some very good responses. And Dave, maybe you could just walk us through some of the areas that we see and that we found in terms of common negotiation challenges. And I mentioned we'd come back to power. So can you start there?
Yeah, sure. So there's a perception, and it's human nature, right, that if I'm a seller, I think that the buyer has ultimate power, that they can say no and they can walk away and buy from a competitor. The reality is much more nuanced than that, but the perception is that I'm really at the complete absolute mercy of the buyer. I think a lot of sellers in the heat of the moment don't really know how to react. They don't plan for a negotiation. So it's very easy on the spot to cave to a demand. When you're dealing with procurement, those guys are pros and they know every trick in the book, and they 100% practices. They do it every single day, and they're always beating up sellers. I also think that there's a fear, obviously, that the buyer can just say no. And I think psychologically, sellers, if they have high goals that someone said in the last chat, they have high sales goals, they have a fear of losing or a failure, right? Like, I lost the deal. Why would I lose a deal over like a 5 or 10% discount? I'd rather just bank my commission and move on.
And I think, David, this still comes back to the whole notion of value. If you actually have confidence that you have the best solution that aligns with the customer's needs, your perception of your power should go up. And the risk of saying no by the buyer should go down. If you're the best solution, a willingness to pay the price you're asking or a fair price should really be there. So I think it gets down to that point that we just had in the chat pod a few minutes ago, which is confident in the value proposition. So let's break down selling a little bit. I'd just like to kind of at a high level go through 3 phases that we think can lead to profitable business. So the first phase is really selling, and that's really all about building relationships, understanding needs, then articulating the value by aligning your solution with the needs, and then going into probably what I consider to be a hugely important area, which is planning for the negotiation. I think that if you just move from selling to negotiating, you're probably missing a crucial step. And so we'll talk a little bit about how do you plan for negotiation. Then we'll talk about negotiation itself. And ultimately, these 3 things done well together lead to profitable business. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to David. Let's just talk about the first one a little bit more about what we can do from a selling standpoint. So with that, let's go to selling and really get back to the importance of value. Go ahead, Dave. I'm sorry.
Well, I was about to make a point that, when we kind of view negotiation through the lens of sales, right, high-level sales, selling and negotiating are really joined at the hip. So there's a lot of great negotiation programs out there that focus on, all of the right negotiation concepts. But from the point of view of the sales rep, great negotiation, kind of the success starts with great selling.
Absolutely. I think it's a really important point because if you go into the in-flight magazines and the airplane, you'll see that there can be negotiation programs, and negotiation we'll see is a really important skill set. But when we talk about sales negotiation, to look at negotiating without selling and planning is, in our opinion, a huge mistake, because it's the selling and the planning that will lead to a much more collaborative and more effective negotiation. So totally agree with that point that from a salesperson's lens, the negotiation process should include all 3 of these areas.
Right. And, again, our perspective is that great negotiation outcomes really starts with uncovering value. And what I mean by that is the cause of most negotiable problems or issues are really derived in a sales context from kind of a misalignment on value, meaning the buyer doesn't understand all of the ways that your solution can help them. And when they understand value, it helps get out of the procurement trap of commoditization. And probably the most important thing is that it gives you leverage. So if you have a differentiated solution, you clearly demonstrated, quantified the value of your solution, that gives you negotiation leverage. The buyer's going to say, I want to deal with you, Norman. I don't need to talk to your competitor. I'm in too much of a hurry. So again, it starts with value.
So, Dave, let me ask you a question. When you think about salespeople, particularly, I think someone in the introduction was interested in how to onboard new salespeople. When salespeople aren't selling on value, what do you think they could be doing differently or better than they're currently doing? Because when we get calls from prospective clients all the time, hey, we'd like to introduce a program that has value selling as part of the component. We want to do a better job of positioning our solutions to align with the customer's needs. So clearly there's a desire to that. What do you think is actually happening at a tactical level that's maybe salespeople should be trying to do better in order to establish and articulate value?
Well, unfortunately, what I'm going to say is shockingly simple, and I don't want to disappoint people, but whether it's a highly transactional sale or a sophisticated sale with a very long sales cycle, we've looked at hundreds of different sales organizations, and it really comes down to the reps or the account executives are hyper-focusing on features. If it's a technical sale, maybe they're selling some kind of SaaS service. We've seen time and time again where they're having a conversation that's too low level and hyper-focused on features and not really focusing on value drivers that people who are more senior, those drivers are important to them.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned SaaS, where you've been working with a company that's a leader in SaaS software. And it was really interesting in looking at how they sell. The number one thing was to really ask questions to identify use cases, because when they understood, as opposed to selling the features, if you understand the use cases, you can then really talk about how those features become solution to the specific use cases. So again, what I would add that's remarkably simple is making sure you're asking enough questions to really understand the buyer's needs so you can align the solution. I think particularly with I guess it's not just junior reps, it could also be very experienced reps. We are so anxious to share what our products can do that we forget to really understand the customer's problems and provide context. And I think we sometimes move from sales mode to pitch mode, and we really have to slow it down a little bit and make sure that we're asking the right questions. And Dave, one of the areas that you worked on from a instructional design standpoint is really using questions to identify value selling opportunities. And maybe just at a high level, just take us through some of those question types.
Well, what we want to do with the people in our programs is have them focus on what are some of the business problems, right, that your buyers are thinking about, and how does your solution develop value for them and create value for them. How does it improve their image? How does it make them more money? How does it improve productivity? How does it, help them get a competitive advantage vis-a-vis the competition? How does it drive customer satisfaction or reduce total cost of ownership? A lot of our customers start, with the presenting problem is, hey, my team, they need to do a better job closing, or they need to do a better job negotiating. And what we like to tell them is they can do a better job doing those things if they start here. So if they're able to slow it down and understand how their solution impacts the buyer, those other problems that were the presenting issues will kind of resolve themselves.
Right, and you think about some of these, if it can really enhance their image or can save them money or can increase productivity or gives them a competitive advantage, all these create more value and are ways to inoculate from discounting, at least give you a lot more leverage when you go into that negotiation.
Right.
So one of the things that's always been interesting to me, and I know, Dave, we've done some research on, but let's pull in our participants again. Hopefully we can get some broad participation. You can just type in one or two ideas. Again, use the question box. What are the most important skills and attributes for great negotiators? So if you think about great negotiators, hopefully in a sales context, but even just generally, we'd love to just get some of your thoughts around what are the most important skills or personal attributes for great negotiators. And I'll just throw out a couple. One is they're really good at making connections. They can create strong relationships, so they have a high degree of likability. Alonzo, what else are we seeing? I'm seeing patience show up. So great negotiators are patient. What else?
Norm, on your, go ahead, Alonzo.
No, go ahead, David.
No, he's got a whole list of
I see Stephanie with listening skills. I was actually Stephanie, that's a great point, and I was just going to say that active listening skills is probably one of the most important things a great negotiator can do. And to your point about relationship building, there's a saying in negotiation, be hard on the problem, soft on the person.
Right. So I'm looking at some of these listening skills from Stephanie. Patience, ability to keep calm. We're going to talk more about that. Again, listening skills, asking the right questions and the ability to listen, reading people's reactions. I think high degree of emotional intelligence and expression is really important. People with really good emotional intelligence are going to be able to kind of see through, particularly when we get to various negotiation styles. Again, high levels of emotional intelligence would be a great attribute. Some of that might be trainable, some of that may not be. Really good input. Appreciate everyone taking the time to share some of their response. Really nice input from our participants. So let's just take a look at a couple of these, maybe in more detail, and I'll go through some of the technical skills that we often see. Let me see if I can advance the slide here. There we go. Thank you. So some of the technical skills. Number one is really this idea of uncovering interest. So uncovering interest is really there's something we refer to as a position and an interest. I'll just give a little bit of an example there. A position might be, we would never do that. When a buyer or a procurement person says, we would never do that, you really don't want to say, please, you don't want to necessarily argue the position. What you really want to do is help me understand why you wouldn't ever do that. So you really want to understand what are the interests behind the positions, and make sure you're using your questioning skills to do that. Probably the number one attribute of great negotiators is really coming up with creative options. If you, in this, again, it gets to the planning stage, if you can develop a lot of creative options, you're going to be able to, again, insulate from pricing. You might find that there's options related to technical support. There's options related to extending the life of the contract. There's options related to providing some training services. So getting creative with options, and it'll set you up also for really good trading, is a great way to insulate against discounting. And also it shows a level of preparation and a level of collaboration you would want to have with your customers. Considering the power sources, so I think this is the second or third time we've mentioned power, really thinking through what are the customer's options. When you're working with a potential buyer, how much power do they really have? Are you in fact the best solution? If there are competitive solutions, how much better is your solution than a competitive solution? If in fact there's another solution that might be marginally better than yours, then you might want to think about, again, those creative options. What can I do to make my solution at least as attractive as something else they're valuing? And that may also come down to really selling yourself. We find that people not only buy from companies or buy products, but they also put a lot of confidence in the person they're working with. Trade strategically. Again, maybe this comes back to discounting, but we'll provide a little bit of thoughts around a trading matrix we suggest that allows you to sequence how you're going to trade in a way that makes sense. And then think about your walkaway position. At what point does it pay to kind of walk away and take a breather? Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose a deal, but also shows that you've really thought through how far you're willing to go to make a deal. And again, that does not need to be adversarial. It's simply a business point. Again, the goal is to always keep things cordial and collaborative, not always possible. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So Dave, with that, I want to transition back to you and kind of move from the selling stage to the planning stage.
Yeah, and I just want to take up kind of, you kind of went through a nice list of at a really tactical level, very specific negotiation skills. If you were asking me what the most important negotiation skill, it happens before the negotiation, and that's in planning. And I just want to spend a few minutes talking about planning and how really great negotiators can really differentiate themselves from planning. So you talked about uncovering interest, and just developing questions to do that. You can't really do this on the fly. So have you thought through the questions you want to ask? If someone's going to push back on price and maybe they're going to push back on budget, if they say, boy, that's too expensive, why is it too expensive? And maybe it's, well, I don't have enough budget this year. Maybe you can structure the payments over a couple of years, or maybe my department doesn't have the budget. So maybe you need to go and get another, a second department's budget involved. Or maybe there's some ROI requirement that the buyer isn't understanding that you're not meeting. So really knowing how to uncover interest, and that starts in great planning, meaning have you developed your great questions before you even talk to your buyer? You talked about options, and I think this is research now. Don't hold me to it because I think it came from another training company, and this is probably over 20 years old, but I think the concept is still valid, which is when they did research, great negotiators on average developed 5 to 6 options for each problem. So think about that. I mean, usually, when you're negotiating, it's easy to come up with 1 or 2 obvious options, but to really think about and have the discipline to plan and develop 3, 4, 5, 6 options, that just takes a lot of discipline, and it's not easy to do, but really great negotiators can do that. Planning in advance how you're going to sequence your options, that is important to do. And also having the discipline to always ask for something in return and not just present an option without asking for something, without trading.
So Dave, without getting too technical, I'm just going to kind of share the trading matrix that I referenced earlier. And what you want to do is think about the options that you've come up with and look at each of the 4 quadrants and start thinking about the options in each quadrant. So if you look at quadrant 1, those are things that have relatively low cost to you as a seller or to your company and have a lot of value to the buyer. So obviously, if you're going to start making trades, and again, you want to get something back, it's easiest to start in quadrant 1. So if you thought about all the different options that you have and how important they would be to your customer, you can basically plot them on this matrix. And so you'd want to start in quadrant 1, things that are relatively low cost to you and high value to the buyer. And then trade strategically in quadrant 2. Those are things that are still highly valued to your customer, but they also cost you a fair amount. And price would definitely be one of those. Quadrant 3, low impact. These you just are small things you can offer. They don't cost you very much, but they may also not have a huge amount of value to your customer. And then quadrant 4, you just absolutely want to avoid because these are things that are low value to your customer and again, high cost to you as a company. So if you think about, just preparing for a negotiation, you've developed these creative options. Plotting these options in advance and having them kind of in your pocket as you start to speak to someone really gives you a much more controlled negotiation process. So again, that's kind of the Cliff Notes version of the trading matrix. With that, I want to kind of get to negotiating. Again, we look at sales negotiation as including all of these steps. But Dave, when we negotiate, the people we negotiate with, while we always want to have the negotiation collaborative, so we'd always like it to look like the right-hand side on the top, where we have a collaborative negotiation. The emphasis should always be on win-win, but we may encounter different personalities. I'm just curious if you can give a couple of quick thoughts on, what should be going on from the seller's perspective as they encounter people with different negotiating styles.
Yeah, I think a seller, so now we've done our planning, we've done our selling, we've done our planning, and now we're actually in the negotiation. I think as a seller, you should have some self-awareness as to what your style is. And to me, the real danger area is if you have an accommodating style, right, and you're going up against someone who's adversarial. In that situation, you have to be extremely careful that you really understand the economics of what that person's asking for, that you've developed a lot of options that you can trade and get creative, that you've really done your planning and homework so that you don't get kind of pushed into a corner by someone who's a very aggressive negotiator. Now, sometimes when you're going up against someone who's adversarial, it's okay to push back, right? A lot of times they don't take it personally, and it's okay to say no. But it's important that you have that self-awareness so you know what things you can do to compensate for your style if you're too accommodating.
And absolutely saying no is a reasonable outcome, or if you feel you're really being pushed, you could say, hey, you know what, let me think about that and get back to you. And then you can take your time to come up with more options. You don't have to close every deal in real time. But I think the biggest risk, Dave, that you mentioned is for someone who's trying to be collaborative or accommodating to get pushed by someone who's highly adversarial. and then start to regret some of the concessions they ended up making later. Particularly if you do have high value to your customer, you want to, again, focus on the value you're providing and not let them control the negotiation process. I know that one of the areas that often comes up is manipulative tactics. These could be used, and there's a number of different ones. And I'm just going to, in the interest of time here, just maybe ask you about a couple, and that we've experienced and our clients have experienced. Dave, tell me a little bit about future promises. So quite often I can say, like in our business, we'll be working with someone, say, we really just want to start with this one program, but if this really goes well, then there's a lot of opportunity here. Your perspective on future promises?
Yeah, I mean, again, these manipulative tactics have very colorful names. I mean, ultimately, future promises is a really common tactic, and as a seller, we always tell our sellers to ignore it. We don't value a future promise unless it's committed to writing. So if someone were to say, for example, hey, you need to give us a lower price to get your foot in the door at XYZ, we're a really big company. If the idea is to get a concession or a discount, I would only do that in the context of trading for some volume guarantee. So if someone's making a promise about future business or future high volume, it's important as a seller that you don't take that at face value, because obviously it's typically not worth a lot, that you come right back at the person and have them make a commitment to that future business.
Great. Let's take another one. Hey, Dave, we'd really love to get this done, but we just don't have the budget right now.
So, typically that would come in the context of I need a discount because you're over my budget, or I love everything you're doing, but my hands are tied. I have a budget constraint. And that to me is something that you really need to dig deeper in terms of tell me about your budget constraint to understand, is it an absolute constraint, or, are there ways around it? So is it there's multiple budgets the project can come from, there's new pockets of money that are available that go outside of the budget, or there are different ways of looking at the project. Maybe the project can be sliced and diced in a way to meet the budget. So generally, when I hear that, what they're trying to basically do is say, hey, you're a great guy, or you're a great person, your product is great, but my hands are tied here. That's really what they're trying to argue.
I'll give you one more. I know but this is really interesting. Higher authority. Hey, Dave, I'd really love to do this, but my boss says we just can't move forward without a additional 5% discount.
Yeah, that's like a kind of a different side of the same coin as a budget constraint, right? I mean, that's really saying, I really like it. I want to move forward, but my hands are tied. And there, I think it's important to understand, can I meet with that person? And the root cause of that, in some cases, it's a real issue. And, that may be a symptom of selling too low. So you sold too low, then all of a sudden the key decision maker looks at the proposal and says, $50,000, like, where is this coming from? So sometimes it's a real problem that's hard to fix because you sold too low and now it's a little bit too late. And sometimes it's just a tactic. And if it's a tactic, it's really important that you try to flip it around and get, FaceTime with that person to really understand, what is the concern, if there is any.
Right, and I think this is just also provides a really good example of the importance of the selling before you negotiate, because one of the key things in selling, particularly if there's going to be a negotiation towards the end of the sale, is making sure that you've mapped the organization to install and really understand who's involved in the decision-making process. And so quite often, if we don't do that, we do end up selling too low, not because we intentionally sold too low, but we really didn't take the time to understand who are the key influencers, who are the key decision makers. And so we're all of a sudden caught by surprise, either by a mystery decision maker or someone higher up in the organization. Just briefly, I want to comment on a couple of procurement tactics. I know that my partner, Ray Makla, who's an expert in negotiation, has written quite a few white papers that are available on our website on procurement. But here are some of the procurement tactics. They may try and deflect or discredit your value proposition, not because you don't provide the value. It's just simply in their best interest to move the conversation from value to price. And one of the things you want to do is really make sure that the key stakeholders are in contact with the procurement and really advocating for the value that you bring. So they may try and commoditize and control your response. They may want to come out with an RFP, and they may say your only point of contact is with procurement. We're somewhat cynical there. We feel like if you don't have unless you're selling a commodity, unless you if you don't have a relationship, you don't understand the decision factors, you don't have support, you really have to question whether you're really going to be able to be effective. It's simply a procurement spreadsheet bake-off. They may want to, again, kind of, as you said, David, two sides of the coin, limit access to the business owners. Again, your goal as a sales professional is to sell deep and wide in the organization. If in the past you had an issue, let's say you were late with a delivery or maybe something didn't work out as well, they may try and use that against you. Again, think about when you're working through your options, what concerns might come up. Again, the best salespeople and the best negotiators have thought about objections that might come up and already are prepared to speak to those. And again, they may introduce someone you haven't met before, again, trying to map that organization in advance. And one of the questions I often use is, help me understand how you're going to make the decision-making process. We really want to make sure we're in touch with all the key decision makers, and having the person we have the relationship just walk us through. If they're not quite sure, question I might ask is, have you purchased something like this, similar to this in the past? What was that process like? Again, we're just trying to really understand how do we navigate our way to yes. Dave, we talked about tactics, but we also use an acronym tactic, and it ties to some of the comments we saw around patience and listening. And so if you're involved, going back to our styles in an adversarial negotiation, whether that be with procurement or someone else, here, maybe just tell us about a few techniques we might want to think about.
Yeah, people love talking about dealing with the adversarial negotiator. I think it's just a fear factor. So I think, first of all, don't take it personally, don't get emotional, so take a deep breath. I think it's okay to acknowledge if there's a fundamental disagreement, but clarify what the issues are, right? So try to understand what are the underlying issues that are keeping you guys apart, and transfer the focus of the discussion from the presenting problem, like your price is too high, this is crazy, to the underlying problem, which is maybe I don't understand the value. Okay, I'm keeping it really simple. Investigate alternatives. Make sure that you've done your homework, you've done your planning, and you have options. So anytime you go into any negotiation, always have 2, 3, 4, maybe more if you're a really great planner, options that you can talk about with someone, particularly someone who's hostile. I think they'll appreciate the creativity, and it'll help you get out of that, corner that adversarial negotiator wants to paint you in. And then also make sure that you talk about next steps so that you don't leave anything hanging out there, and that could be as simple as, okay, so if I do this, you're going to do that, or I'm going to follow up and do X, Y, and Z. But really make sure that everyone understands what are the next steps. How do we go from where we are now to a closed deal?
I think that's really helpful. I want to come back to clarify the concerns and transfer focus. So I think quite often there's almost a microscope that gets placed on concerns. And one of the things you want to try and do is come back when you transfer the focus, remind whoever you're negotiating with all the areas that you agree on and resell the value. So even though there will kind of be this microscope on where you might be apart, you want to, again, broaden that conversation. And by reminding the buyers of all the areas that you agree on and the areas that you're creating value, you'll be able then to really confirm those next steps. And as part of those next steps, I would say making sure that the next steps are not simply what you're going to do, but based on what you're going to do, what they're going to agree to. And quite often it helps to confirm that in an email, because if in fact you're making these concessions, you want to make sure that they've agreed that they're actually going to sign. So getting that in an email and getting that in writing and having them agree to that, again, helps inoculate against another bite of the apple, to use our opening conversation. In thinking about this again, selling, planning, negotiating used in that sequence will allow for the most profitable business relationship. So that's really the goal of a negotiation. And I want to just share some key takeaways, kind of summarize the major areas that we've talked about. So focus on value early in the sales process. Again, that's all about doing a great job of selling. Planning is essential. If you're not doing a good job of planning, you're probably not going to be as effective as you could be in negotiation. Think about what are all the options. Again, to David's point, those that come up with the most options. Don't get fooled in terms of how much power you think the buyers have. If you've done a great job of presenting value, you have a lot more power than you think, particularly if you have a great solution. Don't get caught up in positions. Really clarify and focus on interests. Use trading to avoid discounting. So really think about maybe the quadrants and how you're going to sequence your trades. And don't fall victim to manipulative tactics. Think about what you can do to kind of respond to those in a way that's professional, but not allowing you to get pushed into a corner. So again, some really nice takeaways, hopefully that something you'll find helpful to share with your sellers. And with that, Alonso, we have a little bit of time, so let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Norman. Yeah, let's do one question. It's based on a comment from Johnny Stanshu. If you are working on, telling a rep to avoid discounting, but a common objection that you hear is, any business is better than no business. How do you overcome that objection?
I think that first of all, I wouldn't necessarily agree that any business is better than no business. I think that you always have to look at the profitability. And I would say that any profitable business is better than no business. And that might be one way of looking at it, but I think it's overly simplistic. The goal of a professional seller is to be able to have price integrity. And so I would feel that the conversation with that salesperson should really shift to value and really taking a look at that specific opportunity. What level of discount is a customer asking for? Why is the customer asking for that discount? And maybe just asking the salesperson, hey, discounting is something that we have to do from time to time. But before we do that, why don't you just walk me through what we did to establish our value? So what was the customer's need? How did our solution align with the need? And so even though you may end up discounting because you're too late in the process for that particular opportunity, it's really a great training moment for that salesperson to get them thinking about maybe what they could have done differently and what they will do differently the next time, in terms of really asking the right questions, actively listening, slowing down the process a little bit to understand needs, and then presenting the solution to capture the most value. Again, I think it still comes down to value. You may be too late for that particular transaction, but again, I think this is where managers have to move from managers to really being great coaches and helping their salespeople sell on value.
That's great, Norman. Thank you. We have a question from Nathan reading right now. He said, you mentioned the bake sale scenario. Any negotiation tactics recommended for the government require 3-bid type scenarios, particularly with type RFPs parameters?
Dave, you want to take this, or you want me to take a shot at it? I'm happy either way.
So I think there's a couple of issues going here, but there's a government issue and an RFP issue. I mean, Norm, I know you've had experience selling to the government, so I'm not quite sure the exact focus, but why don't you take a stab at least on the government part?
I think that, government, depending on whether it's federal government or local government, they'll have some procurement practices. In federal government, you may need to be something called on GSA schedule for them to buy. Typically, they'll want to go out and get 3 bids. The goal, of course, is to be working with before you even get to the submit a bid process, really working on what are the specifications. Understanding what they're looking for, you might be the best solution and it doesn't always come down to price. So if you're selling a commodity, it may be very different than if you're selling a solution. If you're selling a pure commodity, it may come down to price when you're selling to the government. But typically, there are other considerations beyond price, even in government RFPs.
Yeah, and I would just say in the RFP process in general, it's always a challenge when you're responding to an RFP, whether or not you even want to respond, and that's like that could be a whole nother webinar. I think that you have to be extremely careful in responding to RFPs to make sure that you have an opportunity to really sell your value. A lot of times the RFPs are being driven by procurement, and they want to channel you into a box to commoditize you. So when you think about negotiation problems that are, involved after you respond to an RFP, a lot of times it's how the RFP is structured. And if you have very limited access to the decision makers in terms of understanding what their issues are and presenting your value, it may be something to think about when you're making the decision whether or not to respond to the RFP.
That's great. Thank you, Norman and David. I think at this point we're getting close to the end of the hour. We have maybe 2 more minutes for one more question from Blythe.Collins. He says if you have any advice for an instructional designer on how to design value prop training materials for sales reps, for example, using mnemonics or 2-3 key points, etc.
Well, I'd be happy to talk to that person offline. I just think in general, when you're talking about selling value, it really comes down to, it's not complicated. It comes down to, are you asking great questions to understand the customer's business issue? Are you doing enough research? And if you do proper research and you plan your questions and ask great questions, and then kind of have a framework for quantifying that value based on what you've learned, it's not a complicated exercise.
All right, thank you, David. Okay, with that, we're gonna go ahead and close the Q&A, but before everyone leaves, I have a couple of announcements. If you want to learn more on this topic, feel free to contact us. We'll be very happy to talk to you. And finally, a short survey will show up as soon as we close this webinar. We appreciate any feedback you may have for us as we continue to work and improve this monthly webinar series. Finally, thank you, Norman and David. It was an excellent presentation, and thank you, everyone, for joining us and participating today.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate the great turnout. And Alonso, thank you very much for helping us with the hosting and helping us drive such a great turnout for today's webinar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.